You're listening to the Fan to Fan podcast, and today we're talking about 1994's unreleased Fantastic Four movie. Here we go. Welcome to the Fan to Fan podcast. This is your host, Bernie Gonzalez, and I am here with friend, fan, fellow podcaster, Pete Charbonneau. Pete, how are you doing today?
Oh, hey, Bernie. I'm doing well. How are you?
I am good. So Pete's one half of the So Bad It's ... podcast, along with John Zeminski, and together they talk about all things pop culture, and recently they've been releasing some amazing short...
we like to call them jorts.
Jorts.
Yeah, because we wear jeans when we do them, so they're jean shorts.
So Pete and I have had quite a number of conversations about everything from The Thing, Big Trouble in Little China. One of our last episodes, we shared some recommendations from Buck Rogers to Our Gang. So I think we're both really excited to talk about today's topic, which is the Fantastic Four movie. And specifically, today we're talking about 1994's adaptation of the Marvel Comics long-running comic book created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, for those that aren't aware. And what makes this Fantastic Four 1994 production so, I guess, infamous is the fact that the film was never released, at least not legitimately. So I'll kind of take a step back here and say, Pete, when's the first time you saw the movie?
Well, funny enough, the first time that I saw the movie was last night on YouTube, which it currently appears, and you can currently watch it. How long that will be, who can know? Because like you said, this is one of those lost gems, I guess is one way to put it. I had heard about this through the ages and through the years. I believe we were just talking about, I think there was a clip shown in the documentary on Roger Corman, Corman's World, since he was executive producer on this. It's very much a Roger Corman film, which I'm sure we will get into. So last night was the first time I got to see the entire thing from start to finish, and I am, it made an impression. Dare I say that this conversation we're about to have is going to be fantastic.
I think it cues into exactly what you were just alluding to, is the fact that this movie is almost like an urban legend that's really been accessible to fans through bootleg VHS and then inevitably DVD releases and now online video like on YouTube. So I figured before we actually start talking about the movie, it got me to thinking the only way that you get to see a movie like this is essentially through bootleg or illegitimate sources. So I figured, well, let's talk about that first and kind of see how we feel about it. Because you have obscure or out-of-print, never legitimately released movies like the Star Wars Holiday Special or Disney's Song of the South. And I'm a big Mystery Science Theater 3000 fan, so there's certain episodes, specifically the Godzilla vs. Megalon and Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster, where the show's creators lost the license because the Godzilla folks wanted it back, so they haven't been able to release those episodes. But, of course, like the Fantastic Four 1994 movie, it's available online in places. And there's countless of fan films where the creators don't have the permission or hold the copyright, but, we still see movies that feature Batman, Superman, and other characters, made by fans. But I thought, you know what, let's figure out. So, Pete, how do you feel about bootleg and access to them?
Oh, I mean, it's a tough one because I hate straddling the line on this, but I not only do I see both sides, but I've been guilty of pulling down bootleg. I haven't downloaded bootleg movies, but certainly when Napster came along, that was like the Wild West of music downloads. It's tough. I certainly understand the argument of someone that was involved in the making of these ventures and that they deserve to be paid for their time and for their work. And I know you and I as designers probably come down on the same side of that too. There's a lot of talk sometimes in the design world of should you give your designs away for free? And no, you should never do that. You should be paid for your work. So I heartily understand that sentiment. That being said, when you've got a movie like this Fantastic Four movie or the Star Wars Holiday Special, which sadly or gladly I remember watching when it aired, the one time that it ever aired. I didn't remember much of it because I was still pretty young, but I definitely remember seeing it. There's something about that as a fan of either the series, the movie, the character that it's kind of hard not to pursue and want to track down.
Yeah, and this was a movie that, at least in my time going to comic conventions, you'd go down any row and you would see things like the Star Wars Holiday Special, but it would be right next to a VHS copy of the Fantastic Four movie. So it never felt like I had to go on a chase. I never had to go on an adventure to find it because I could just wait until the next comic convention and it would be there. And then when media went to DVD, the same exhibitors were transferring all their VHS movies and TV shows to DVD. So there it was again, the Fantastic Four 1994 movie on DVD. But if you see it and you're a fan, you watch it. But if you go back and uncover how it was made and how it got to the point where it was never legitimately released, it's like, wow, there's so much more to uncover there that makes it that much more interesting, almost beyond, in this case, the movie.
And I think that's certainly with this is one of the most fascinating things that I came away after watching it, because like I said, I knew bits and pieces of the story of how this had never been released. It was like, the redheaded stepchild of the Marvel universe, like, Marvel higher ups never, and to this day, I don't think want this to see the light of day. But the people involved with it were still pretty proud of it and never really understood exactly why. And I think that's the fascinating thing. I had two immediate reactions as the credits started to roll. The first one was, and this had started as I was watching it, was this movie's not as bad as I thought it was going to be.
Okay.
By no stretch is it a good movie. It's cheesy as hell, and some of that is by design. But I was expecting just absolute atrocious, like The Room, Birdemic level badness. Even though I know what to expect from a Roger Corman movie, it's going to be done on the cheap, it's going to be done quickly. But Roger Corman still, certainly in the early 90s, I think there was still some, I don't know if quality is the right word, but he's not going to give you a total piece of trash. So that was the first thing, was this really is not as bad as I was led to believe it might be. And then the second thing was, and thank you so much for sending me the link on the one story that was written about the making of this, because it just went into details that I was this movie immediately fascinated me and will fascinate me now for the next couple of weeks as I try to dig more on it. And that's just the whole story of how and why it was never released. And I think it's just, it's mind-boggling. And it's one of those things of, it can only happen in Hollywood, that a Hollywood movie is not released by Hollywood.
And it's, of all ironies, the fact that it involves Roger Corman. I think that's the most interesting piece of all of this. And since you were a fan of him, and we'll talk about that article in a second.
Oh, sure. Before we get into that, I'm just curious when the first time that you saw this was.
I actually had to go back to my buddies Andre and Chris, who have been on the podcast as well. And I had to make sure, I'm like, guys, did we watch this during our late 90s? And I got the thumbs up that, yes, we actually had, one of them had purchased a copy. We'd gotten together on like a Saturday night and we saw it, and that we all felt the same way that you just did, which is, this is not as bad as advertised. And when you think of bad movies, so bad they're just bad, like Plan 9 or Manos or The Room,
right?
They have, they have a story, but when you watch the film, you do realize this is bad, and this is not bad in an ironic way like Sharknado, or
yes,
even in like a parody like Black Dynamite, where it's trying to be something else and it's kind of mimicking, it's winking at you and saying, oh look, we're like a black exploitation film, or like a really bad big monster movie, but we're not. This is completely different. This is it has all of this baggage of being bad, and then when you get through just a little bit of it, you realize this is not as bad as I was expecting. And by the time at least I was done, I thought, oh, this is actually pretty decent. And being a comic fan, it's actually a pretty faithful representation of the Fantastic Four. And then, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, when you start stacking on top of it the 2005 release of the Fantastic Four and the 2015 release of the Fantastic Four, you're just like, oh, now I have some comparison here, and I absolutely have some thoughts about that. We'll get to that. But if I wanted to start about Roger Corman, because I know you're a big fan, and he executive produced this, and he worked with Bern Eichinger, and I'm sure I pronounced that completely terribly, who actually did go on to produce the 2005 version of the Fantastic Four. But Roger Corman, independent filmmaker, director, actor, the Pope of pop cinema as he's known for counterculture cult films with low budgets and shooting schedules, that are really more measured more in days than they are in weeks. Gave a start to a ton of young film directors: Francis Ford Coppola, Ron Howard, Martin Scorsese, Peter Bogdanovich, James Cameron. I didn't know Tamar Benkman-Tamabu, who actually went on to direct Wanted, and he did the Night Watch and Day Watch movies, which were kind of like the Russian, like special effects heavy movies, but were, very well received. And then back to Corman, but beyond the directors, worked with Gale Ann Hurd and Jonathan Demme, who was a writer on one of his movies, and helped launch the career of actors like Peter Fonda, Robert De Niro, David Carradine, Sandra Bullock, Dennis Hopper, Charles Bronson, Jack Nicholson. The list goes on and on. As I was kind of going through his Wikipedia entry, I was like, wow, unbelievable what he's done, who he's worked with, the amount of movies he's produced, over 300, and he directed 55 on his own. I know a lot of his work from the 70s after he'd founded New World Pictures. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those cult movies like Women in Cages, Death Race 2000, Rock and Roll High School, Galaxy of Terror, Children of the Corn, Piranha. I mean, those are the movies that I know him for, but force of nature to say the least. So I know you're a fan of Roger Corman.
I am, and there's something about his voice too. Like I can listen to a Roger Corman interview and just kind of get put into the zone. Like it's a little bit droning, but there's something just really soothing about it. Yeah, I mean, you just read an absolutely incredible list of people that he has, I would say, worked with, but a lot of them have worked for him. I mean, like you said, they got their start working for him, and there's just something to be said about that, and I think he had a book, I'm going to butcher the title now, but it's something about like, I made 1,000 movies and never lost a dime or something like that. And he would tell the story of he would go to the publisher. He's like, listen, he's like, I lost some money on a few. He's like, I've made money on most of them. And they're like, Roger, do you want to sell the book? He's like, yeah, call whatever you want. So I just, when you think of how he started out in the 50s, and right from the get-go, there are stories of him kind of, I think his first film, he completely bypassed all like the union rules. Like he had a van loaded with all of his lighting and camera equipment, and he would just show up on the beach. I think it was like Monster from the Ocean Floor was the first film that he directed or that he was involved with. And he jokes about how like he was doing like this wide panning shot, like an establishing shot that's supposed to take place in the jungles of South America, but then you can see the Pacific Coast Highway or in a car like speeding along in the background. So, I think he did it. He made films in a way that made you feel that anyone can do it. It was almost kind of like punk rock in a way. And the fact that he does things, because he's still active to this day, he doesn't really direct anymore, but he still produces. He does things cheaply and on budget and on time, but there's definite craftsmanship to it. It's not like he's just like Ed Wood, where he just shows up and, one take, like, cut it and let's move on. Like, there is a method to his madness, and I think it's why he has endeared for as long as he has, and why he's had so many acolytes and people that have worked for him and have gone on to much success. I think there's a lot to be learned by his filmmaking methods that he just has been able to turn into a cottage industry. Obviously not what everyone wants to do. James Cameron goes from working for Roger Corman to making, Avatar at the time, the most expensive film ever made. So I just think it's a fascinating American and Hollywood story.
And he was able to do it through so many different eras. You think I think it was late 50s when he started, into the mid 60s, he was doing a lot of Edgar Allan Poe type adaptations with The Pit and the Pendulum, House of Usher. And then he goes through all those kind of like counterculture films in the 70s with the Women in Cages, which really kind of creates this whole subgenre of movies of women in cages.
Yes.
It's unbelievable. And then he jumps on the Star Wars bandwagon with Galaxy of Terror. He's able to jump on pop culture waves like Jurassic Park with movies like Carnosaur, which ironically enough has a big connection to the Fantastic Four movie, and then still remains active. This is amazing. This man has been doing this for so long and has all these, like you mentioned, these acolytes that have been able to work kind of like splintered out of him and have done some amazing work on their own.
Absolutely. And like you said, like he spans so many different genres. I think he also famously said that when he was criticized for making exploitation films, he's like, well, of course. He's like, I'm exploiting a topic, whether it's women in prison or what have you. It's like, yes, I'm exploiting it, to make money and to titillate the audience. So, but then at the same time, he was like a huge person. I'm trying to remember if this was before or after he started New Line Cinema, but an absolute stalwart in bringing critically acclaimed foreign films to America. Kurosawa, I think, Truffaut, there's just a ton that, he would somehow pair in drive-in theaters with some of his more goofier, like 50s rubber-suited monster movies as double features, which sounds completely insane, but they worked. They made money. And I think he was finally even given an Oscar at some, like a Lifetime Achievement Award Oscar at some point not too long ago. So he is a wizard and a maestro.
Pete and I will continue talking about 1994's unreleased Fantastic Four movie in a few seconds. But in the meantime, if you are listening on iTunes, please take a moment to rate and review. Just search for the Fan to Fan podcast, go under reviews, enter a star rating, or write a review if you have a second or two, and click send. That's how easy it is. I will greatly appreciate it. Thanks.
And now, on with the show.
So Roger Corman partners up in 1983 with Bernd Eichinger. So this guy is pretty amazing in his own right because he owns and he founded Constantine Studios, and they were best known for The Neverending Story and The Name of the Rose, which, if I'm correct, I think that's with Sean Connery.
Yes.
So Bernd meets with Stan Lee in 1983 to obtain the Fantastic Four license, but the rights aren't available until 86. But then, at that point, Bernd buys the rights for $250,000. I was looking at the time frame and thinking Marvel's Howard the Duck came out in 1986, but I doubt that was his motivation to be that early on what would be like the Marvel movie train. And Howard the Duck would not have been the reason to say, oh, this movie did so well,
right.
Let me jump on board. But you just wonder if that was in the ether. You have a great talent like George Lucas buying a Marvel property, and then you have someone who thinks, well, let me go in there and go after a similar property, something that's big. And then you think of something like 1989's Batman that's released. It does incredibly well and makes superhero movies that much more appealing to studios. The Punisher with Dolph Lundgren is released in 1989. The direct-to-video Captain America movie is released in 1990. So you have all this stuff happening. Marvel's hoping to make more money from the license options. They have this guy now who they've given the license to the Fantastic Four, but Warner Brothers and Columbia are also interested, but Constantine knows all of this, and that studio has no intention of letting the Fantastic Four rights lapse. So it's interesting. It's like watching the movie, knowing about it, but then to know all of this adds so many interesting layers.
Oh, so many. I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at the time, when you look at it now, like selling the rights to the Fantastic Four or the option rights for $220,000 to $250,000 is nothing, even for back then. And I think because Marvel was desperately trying to get their brand up and going, that they were selling a lot of their properties on the cheap.
And to start, it's like when we talk about, we have hindsight on our side. We know what the Marvel Cinematic Universe is, and this is all well before that. And Marvel's going through some financial dire straits, and they're putting up some of their licenses out there on the cheap. And at some point, they partnered up with a toy company. I don't believe it was Toy Biz. I could be wrong, but that was essentially how they were staying afloat. And all of this in a way to kind of come back together and be the Marvel that it is now. But well before all of that, I mean, we're talking a guy who was able to come in with $250,000 and buy the Fantastic Four, a brand that I'm sure under any analysis is worth a lot more than that.
Right. And I think it's interesting, too, because like you said, until DC had some success with the Christopher Reeve Superman, but I want to say I don't remember when the last Superman movie came out of that original run with Christopher Reeve. It might have been like 86, that The Quest for Peace or whatever, but it was kind of running on steam at that point. And this was before the reconfigured Michael Keaton Batman came along that really proved that superhero movies could be big blockbusters and make a lot of money again. I think the 80s it just seemed to be more like your Rambo type. It was like the action movies, which you would think would lend itself towards superheroes, but I guess it just wasn't the right time for the costumed heroes to to seize the silver screen, as it were. So you can understand that there was probably a little bit of skepticism of, is this going to be a moneymaker? Is it not? And Marvel, like you said, they were just trying to get the product out there, and they were trying to build up that interest. So everything was going on the cheap at that point. So just an interesting combination of events and series of events that are leading us on this journey to how the Fantastic Four actually does come about and get made, but still not released.
No, absolutely, yeah. Because then you have this guy who makes now as we kind of talk about it, an incredibly smart financial decision to buy the Fantastic Four for this little. He knows what's on the horizon. He knows that bigger studios like Warner Brothers and Columbia want the rights for the Fantastic Four, asks for an extension, but does not get it. So then he approaches Roger Corman, and 3 days before the rights lapse on December 31st, 1992, Roger Corman begins production December 28th, 1992.
And I believe Roger Corman even said, because the financier Burnt came to him let's start on the 31st, right before. And Roger Corman's like, I would really like a little more time to get prepared. He's like, I don't want to make it too obvious that what we're doing. He's like, whether we start on the 28th or the 31st, I think it's going to be pretty obvious what we're doing. We're just trying to get this. And essentially what he was trying to do was production had to be started by that date for them to retain the rights, I believe. That's correct.
That's right.
The film didn't have to be ready to come out, but they had to start principal photography by then. And so I think that was probably why Roger Corman was brought in, because he was just the guy to, you need something to get turned around fast. He is probably the man to do it. So, so filming started right before New Year's, and we're off and running.
I'm saying, if that wasn't interesting enough, the story gets more interesting moving forward. So it's reportedly, and this is, everywhere online, you get different figures, but for the most part, it's reported it was shot for a budget of $1 to $2 million, although most people tend to go towards the $1 million figure, and it's supposedly over 21 to 25 days. Never saw an official release. Some say it was sold to the production crew and the actors as an inevitable theatrical release to be scheduled to open on Labor Day weekend in 1993. There were trailers that ran in theaters, and on the VHS release for the Roger Corman's Carnosaur release, it actually had a copy of the trailer for the Fantastic Four was in that.
From the pages of the world's greatest comic book adventure, 4 heroes on a daring mission in space, but something went wrong. Genetically transformed, they become the most powerful superheroes of all time. But the forces of evil are out to destroy their cosmic power. And to survive, they must utilize all their strength. To put an end to their arch nemesis.
Doom, it's clobbering time.
Fantastic Four.
But 1993 passes, the movie is not released, and then reportedly it's got a new date where it's going to be released at the Mall of America in Minneapolis on January 19th, 1994, with the proceeds from the event going towards charities like Ronald McDonald House and Children's Miracle Network. But that doesn't happen either. And the cast go out there and they go to all of these conventions, drum up a lot of support. Unfortunately, none of it comes to pass.
They did the whole press junket like you would normally be promoting an upcoming film. And so that's where it kind of gets weird because, like you said, like now you start getting into a who's right, what exactly is going on here, and then you've got conflicting reports as was this movie intended to come out or was it always intended to just kind of be made to retain the rights and it wasn't supposed to come out at all, and was it just supposed to be a quickie, let's just get this film done in the can and it's never going to see the light of day? Or, as I think was argued, why would you go with that premise but then put money into advertising, into cutting a trailer, and then having your actors going out promoting the movie? To me, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. To me, it sounds like it was supposed to be released, or at least someone had intended to release it, but then along the way it was, no, this is not seeing the light of day. And I don't know if it was Marvel, I don't know if it was Burnt. There seems to be, Stan Lee is involved, and no one seems to have a definitive answer as to what the purpose of this movie was going to be.
Perfect segue. So the Stan Lee quote that I found, he said, "It was never supposed to be seen by any living human beings."
Excelsior!
It's missing the Excelsior to be a perfect line, but something that Burnt repeatedly denied. And it makes sense. You think he put this money into getting the rights from Marvel, goes through all this hardship of making a movie. You have all of this publicity going behind it. So the fact that Stan Lee says, never meant to be seen, Burnt says, no, that's not true. But we see it now through these copies that have been made throughout the years. So there isn't at least that we've seen, a high definition version that exists. Roger Corman has denied owning a print. And the negative, this is where we start getting into conspiracy theory, but there are some quotes to back some of this. A negative was presumably purchased by Avi Arad, who becomes a player in this whole thing, for a, quote, couple of $1 million in cash, and then destroys it. And that was reported in an LA Magazine article because it was not meant to be seen, and possibly as a protective measure to protect the brand, the Fantastic Four brand, because Fox was looking to purchase it and they were going to release the inevitable 2005 adaptation. And at the time, Avi Arad, who had a history with Marvel during its kind of like financial dire straits, was kind of trying to wrangle all these rights back. And as he was going through the process, Fantastic Four was one of the big rights that he wanted to get back, at least to Marvel, so they could sell it to, inevitably, Fantastic Four, and for a lot more than $250,000. But it's just interesting, the conspiracy theory behind this. The folks that say, yes, it was meant to be seen, that's why we were out there promoting it, and the folks that are like, no. So I feel there are some confidentiality maybe, or NDAs that are in here where folks are saying, I'm going to give you this money for the print, but you have to stick to the story because that's how we have to sell it. In some cases, I'm sure it was more of a business move, and in some cases where with the cast, it was obviously something that took more personal.
Right, and the cast certainly was never informed that this was not going to be released. I mean, they talk about in the article how, they were excited that they were starring in leads in, well, not a big budget movie, but this was, a Hollywood film. And for some of them, it was, if not their first acting role, it was certainly their first lead acting role. So they're all kind of looking at this as, all right, so here's the jumping off point. So here's the chance for me to start to establish my career. And then the next thing you know is like, oh no, sorry, this is not getting released. So
I think this is a good place to talk about the cast because they have a pretty interesting mix here. And let me go just for a second. So yeah. Fantastic Foe, that's the article by Robert Ito that was in Los Angeles Magazine. So that's the one that I sent you that I found that seemed to be like a really good source on kind of like the behind the scenes for the movie.
Oh, it's a fantastic read. And again, I encourage anyone to check it out. If you're at all intrigued by any of the the machinations going on just by Bernie and I talking up to this point, it brings in a lot of the principal players. It talks to the actors. It talks to Roger Corman, Avi Arad, Bernd. They're all interviewed for this piece, and it's an interesting. It's almost worth a movie in and of itself. Which
yes, it's not like JFK level where it's like back and to the left. That's where they put the negative for the Fantastic Four in the warehouse before it went up in flames. Back and to the left.
It's just such a bizarre story because I get that it seemed like Marvel probably wasn't all that thrilled with the final product, but at the same time, like we said, like for its time, it's not the worst movie. So I'm not quite sure where this like hatred came from. Like, this can never see the light of day. It just, we can't even talk about it. I refuse to speak about this movie. It's just so bizarre on so many different levels that it just makes for a really fascinating story.
Pete and I will conclude our conversation in just a few seconds. But in the meantime, remember you can find the Fan to Fan podcast at www.fanpodcast.com. Facebook, just search Fan to Fan Podcast. That's FAN, the number 2, FAN, or on Twitter at Fan to Fan Podcast. I'd love to hear from you, so reach out, send the message, and let me know what you think of the show. Thanks. All right, so let's talk about some of the folks that star in this story. Alex Hyde White, who plays Reed Richards / Mr. Fantastic. He'd been in Pretty Woman, and in our conversation today talking about, we throw out Indiana Jones. He was actually in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. To go back to our previous conversation where we gave a bunch of recommends, he was in season 2 of Buck Rogers.
Well.
And to keep the sci-fi thing going, he was actually in an episode of Babylon 5. He was also in Pretty Woman, too. So, seems TV, movies, he's in a little bit of everything. Jay Underwood plays Johnny Storm / Human Torch, and I think famously he was in Uncle Buck, but he'd also been in Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, and he also was in an episode of X-Files. Rebecca Stabb is Sue Storm / The Invisible Woman. She was a model, but she was also in Cheers, Seinfeld, The Wonder Years, a ton of different sitcoms that I saw on her IMDb page. Michael Bailey Smith, he played Ben Grimm. He was in the, of course, legendary Cyborg 3, not 1 or 2, but 3. I guess he was a main villain in Charmed, but he was also in Diagnosis Murder in a few episodes. And ironically enough, Patrick Warburton auditioned for the role of Ben Grimm. So I wonder how old he would have been at the time. Interesting. The Thing in the suit is played by Carl Chiarfillo, and I figured at least give him some credits there. Joseph Culp, he played Victor Von Doom, Dr. Doom, and he was the son of Robert Culp.
I thought so. Okay. Yeah.
And he also played Don Draper's father in Mad Men. And Mark Ruffalo auditioned for the role of Victor Von Doom. So that would have been interesting because I was trying to do the math. I'm like, all right, well, Mark Ruffalo seems like he's a little older than we are, so I'd probably say maybe late 40s.
Yeah, I think late 40s sounds right, yeah.
Maybe, this was 94, so 20 plus
like
years ago.
22.
So,
I mean, that still seems a little young for
that role, especially when you think, Alex Hyde White, who looked like he was probably at least in his mid-early 30s. So it seems like that role would have, if Mark Ruffalo had gotten it, would have been younger. Maybe at that point, Reed Richards would have been more like the mentor role to Victor Von Doom. But
right. And the film does start out with movie. I don't know if there's film status, but the movie does start out with them in grad school.
Exactly, yes. So we see a little bit of that history. And when we see them in those roles, George Gaines is actually the professor in the classroom.
That was my first laugh out loud moment right off the bat.
Same here.
And I had a few.
Yes. And he was in Punky Brewster and Police Academy, of course. But to see that in that role, I was waiting. The whole movie, I'm like, of course, it's George Gaines. He's going to come back as the professor, right? I mean, you don't bring in George Gaines for what amounts to maybe 10 seconds of screen time. I thought...
that would be very, very, very bad.
Kat Green plays Alicia Masters, and she actually went on to do a lot of music composing. It's kind of cool. And Ian Trigger, of course, that's his real name, plays the jeweler. And I'll have some choice words about him in a little bit.
Right.
So any comments about the cast, Pete, before we move on to the crew?
Lots.
Did they feel right? Let's start with that. Did they feel right?
Feel right. Mm-hmm. No, I think that was one of the things. It wasn't super off-putting. I didn't buy Alex Hyde White as the older Reed Richards.
Okay.
I mean, basically, they just throw some, the white streak on the side of his head. It was, I don't know. I don't know if I could put my finger on it. I mean, it was fine. It's a very different era when you look at the physiques, other than, what's his name? Michael Bailey Smith, who plays Ben Grimm, who's obviously pretty built the other, like Alex Hyde White and Jay Underwood, and it's just very different when you get to the later version. You got like Chris Evans, pre-Captain America, but still pretty fit in the role of Johnny Storm. So it was more just kind of, it was almost like a community theater version of Fantastic Four, where they're just like, hey, I always wanted to be Johnny Storm. Oh, you got the part. Go ahead, buckaroo. But that being said, I did get a kick out of Joseph Culp. He was probably my favorite actor because I thought that he played Doctor Doom about as well as could be played for the time period and given the material.
Pitiful. You are pitiful. Half the fun is the chase. You've robbed me of even that. At least you've left me the pleasure of the kill. That is, of course, after I've taken from you what I want.
He was obviously having some fun. He was camping it up. There were a lot of like really bad jokes and one-liners, but it was very much in keeping with. And I'm not a huge Fantastic Four fan, so I have to say that up front. So I'm not well versed in the entire lore of the Fantastic Four, but from what I have read and seen, I think that he played the character. And they all played them all pretty straight. I mean, every beat is hit, and you don't need to know too much about the Fantastic Four. Like, everything is pretty much thrown at you. Like, oh, and this is when this happens, and this is when this happens. And, oh, there's the blind woman that Ben Grimm falls in love with. And, it's all there as far as an origin story goes. It's all just kind of thrown into the mix, and they take off from there. So, yeah, my comments more about just, like, the characters, I think, than the actors per se. I thought they were fine. I was confused about the jeweler, Ian Trigger. I don't know if he is a character in the Marvel Universe or if they just...
No, it was strictly created for this. They did not have... And this is where the whole rights licensing thing gets interesting, because you have, in the modern day, 20th Century Fox still holds the rights to the Fantastic Four, and a part of it is the fact that you have the universe also as well. So Galactus is very much a part of the Fantastic Four universe. So if Marvel says, hey, we want to have a big Infinity War and we're going to have Galactus in the background, they can't because it's a part of the Fantastic Four universe. So then technically 20th Century Fox owns the rights. So that was in the Fantastic Four, Rise of the Silver Surfer. Silver Surfer, part of Fantastic Four, they get that. But it's interesting that they did not have the rights for Mole Man, who is very much a Fantastic Four character. So maybe it just goes to show that at the time, Marvel was either very select in saying, we'll give you the rights to certain characters because we just kind of need the money. And if we give you the rights to the Fantastic Four and Doom, then that's what you get. But you don't get the rights to the whole universe. Versus now, where I'm sure, it commands a lot more than what they paid for it. But then you get a lot more for it.
Sure. And it's interesting. The whole rights thing with characters is very interesting to me, too, because I remember when they rebooted the Fantastic Four cartoon in the early 80s, they did away with the Human Torch and they introduced this robot called Herbie.
Something is wrong. My sensors tell me Reed Richards is behaving strangely.
And remember, it probably is still a very sore point for Fantastic Four fans. And I used to think that it was just some arbitrary decision because it was the early 80s and because of Star Wars. We'll throw a robot in there. Meanwhile, who wouldn't want to be like a human flame flying around? But I guess it turns out that they didn't have the rights to use the Human Torch. The Human Torch character was separately sold off, and I don't know who owned the rights, but they could not use the Human Torch when they redid the cartoon. So these rights with characters, it's really fascinating.
Yeah, and it's kind of thing where this movie, of course, was kind of like a victim to the whole idea of rights, and you wonder if I don't know if having the rights to the Mole Man would have saved the movie. There are times where all the jeweler scenes seem a bit superfluous.
I was just going to say the same thing. I thought that was just an added plot development that they could have done away with and just hashed out the Fantastic Four versus Doctor Doom storyline a little bit better.
And I think it's a case where, we're not necessarily going to go dig through the plot, but I guess when I was watching the movie again, I thought, well, really the only connective tissue between the jeweler scenes outside of his kidnapping of Alicia Masters is when he gets the somewhat despondent Thing to kind of join his underground band of misfits, but then because Dr. Doom tries to get back the genuine jewel that the jeweler has, and then eventually kind of seizes the diamond by force, because the thing is there, he knows that Doom has it. So that's kind of his ability to go back to Reed and to Sue and Johnny and say, hey, I know where the jewel is, and I also need your help because he kidnapped Alicia, so we need to kind of figure all this out. But beyond that, if the jewel had somehow been kept in a museum, then there's no need for the jeweler to even exist in the movie.
Right, and that's what I was confused with, too, because there's that scene early on where, for people that know the origin story of the Fantastic Four, there's this diamond jewel that the jeweler steals and replaces it with a fake one that they end up putting on the ship that goes out into space and malfunctions, and that's how they get the Fantastic Four are hit with the radiation and rays that give them their superpowers. And I feel like it would have been a lot more effective if Dr. Doom had done that somehow, but he's basically monitoring the situation, and when he sees the jeweler replace it, he's like, haha, I don't even have to do it now. It's like, my work is done. Like, and he basically, for the first portion of the movie, is like sitting behind a monitor, and there's like this weird sliver of light that comes across his eye because you're kind of supposed to wink, wink, nudge, nudge, not know that it's Victor Von Doom, but we all know who it is, so I thought that was kind of odd.
There's a lot of ha-haing on his part.
Yes, he does. There's a lot of bellowing and guffawing.
So that's in my kind of notes as I was going through the movie again and going beyond plot and just more to observations. There is a documentary that was released a few years ago, and it's called Doomed, The Untold Story of Roger Corman's The Fantastic Four. And it's kind of along the lines of Best Worst Movie with Troll 2, or even The Death of Superman Lives, What Happened, unreleased Nicolas Cage version. But it was directed by Marty Langford. It was funded by a crowdsourcing campaign, has virtually the entire cast. It has Corman, the director of the movie, Oli Sasson, the crew, and they talk about, about the movie itself. But when they interviewed Joseph Culp, he mentions how he was told to mimic Mussolini's hand motions when he was giving speeches. So that made sense in a way of the, kind of exaggerated hand motions that he was doing, which kind of amounted to this like poor man's Darth Vader. But it was still very much an over-the-top performance that Joseph Culp was doing.
The one thing that I kept annoying me slightly was the clickety-clackety of his hands. It was like
his fingers, yeah.
Like Foley artists might have just wanted to just cut that out entirely. I don't know if that was really needed for the film, but yeah, it was getting on my nerves by the end. Like every time he was like running his fingers over something, or even if they weren't, like even if he was just like kind of flexing his fingers, you'd hear like the click, click, clack, clack, clack of the, I guess what's supposed to be the metal appendages on his gloved hand, but that was kind of bizarre.
And speaking of Foley, there were a lot of ADR issues because there are times where he's, to quote The Incredibles, monologuing, and it just feels like he's covering his mouth. And due to some poor ADR, you're just like, I want to hear what you're saying. Yeah. I know this is the part where you're sharing your master plan, but I can't hear you because this is how you sound.
Victor? Victor? A name from the past. You may call me Dr. Doom. Fateful night, 10 years ago, made me what I am today. I had such a unbearable hatred for you, Reed, for turning me into this. Look at it! See it!
And obviously you don't have the money for ADR, and I get it, but can you not have spared a little bit of time? And it's funny because Joseph Culp says if there's ever a release for this, that he's more than happy to go back into studio and release an ADR. And I just feel like, all right, guys, and maybe those will be my final comments when we'll get to them. I'll share that. But ADR, definitely an issue.
And that's incredibly nice of him. That is such a generous offer for him to go back and redub his dialogue. So,
in fairness, he might want to get paid for it.
I would expect that he would, yes.
All right, so that wraps up part one of our discussion on 1994's unreleased Fantastic Four movie. But come back next time where Pete and I return to conclude our conversation on the Fan to Fan podcast. Thanks for listening.
Don't be alarmed, gentlemen. The effects of the paralysis ray gun will wear off in a short time.